Shell loaded now!
Breach locked! Ready to fire on your command!
They called it the Iron Cathedral, the 3-story disaster, the coffin for 7 brothers, and even the Germans laughed and named it a splendid target. And in 1941, the M3 medium tank stood as the most mocked armored vehicle on Earth, a towering 10-foot silhouette crawling across training fields and factory yards with a hull-mounted 75mm gun that looked ripped from a battleship of the previous war, a machine so awkward in shape and design that even its own crews questioned whether anyone in their right mind would choose to fight inside it. Yet this strange, ungainly vehicle was born not from ignorance or incompetence, but from desperation and time pressure. Because while German armor was carving through Europe with speed and precision, and British forces were being driven back across the deserts of North Africa, American military planners watched the collapse of France in 1940 and understood with brutal clarity that warfare had fundamentally changed. Tanks were no longer slow-moving infantry companions, but the decisive arm of modern battle. And the United States Army, possessing barely 400 mostly obsolete tanks armed with machine guns or small 37mm cannons, knew that if America entered the war, its soldiers would face the most experienced armored force in history, with weapons designed for a previous generation. So the Army demanded a medium tank carrying a 75mm gun, not merely for its caliber, but for its versatility, because such a weapon could fire armor-piercing rounds to destroy enemy tanks and high-explosive shells to smash bunkers, machine gun nests, and infantry concentrations, something smaller guns simply could not do. And this dual-purpose capability was vital, as British crews had already learned the hard way with their 40mm 2-pounders that could punch armor but lacked effective high-explosive ammunition, leaving them helpless against fortified positions and forcing them to charge suicidal distances just to scratch German paint while Panzer. Shells cut through their vehicles from twice the range. Yet while the need for a 75mm tank was obvious, American industry, in 1940, was not ready to produce it properly, because large turret rings required extreme precision engineering to absorb recoil forces when a big gun fired, and a 75mm cannon demanded a ring over 60 inches in diameter, something American foundries simply could not cast or machine with sufficient accuracy at the time. And although engineers were already designing what would become the M4 Sherman with a proper rotating turret and balanced layout, that tank would not reach the battlefield in numbers until late 1942, leaving a dangerous gap when armor was needed immediately, not in 2 years. So at Rock Island, Arsenal engineers proposed a compromise that made everyone uncomfortable, suggesting they mount a 75mm gun and hull instead of a turret, an outdated concept reminiscent of World War I sponsons that limited firing arcs and forced the entire tank to turn to engage targets on the flank, a fatal delay in fast-moving combat. Yet they knew that an imperfect tank now was infinitely better than a perfect tank later, and with no alternative available, the Army approved the design in July 1940, produced a prototype by January 1941, and began mass production that August, giving birth to the M3 medium tank, a vehicle that stacked its components vertically with an aircraft-derived Continental R975 radial engine in the rear, the 75mm gun embedded in the right front hull, a small turret above carrying a 37mm cannon for lighter targets, and a commander's cupola perched on top of that, creating a 3-level structure nearly 10 feet tall that earned it the nickname 3-story disaster, housing 7 crewmen inside riveted steel armor up to 51mm thick at the front, armor that carried a deadly flaw because non-penetrating hits could shear rivet heads loose inside the hull, turning them into lethal shrapnel bouncing around a cramped metal box, and combined with its towering profile that made concealment almost impossible. These weaknesses meant American tankers did not merely mock the M3, they feared it. Yet between August 1941 and December 1942 American, factories produced over 6,000 of these machines because there was nothing else available to fill the gap, and while the M3 trained crews in the United States and Britain debated its merits, events in North Africa were reaching a crisis point as the British Eighth Army had been losing ground for 18 months when Field Marshal Erwin Rommel arrived in February 1941 with a small German force to support Italian allies, rapidly pushing British troops back to the Egyptian border and establishing himself as the most feared commander in the desert, culminating in Operation Crusader in November 1941, where over 700 British tanks attacked Rommel's positions only to suffer catastrophic losses, as German anti-tank guns and Panzers picked them off from long range, exposing the brutal engagement math of the Desert War, where German 50mm guns could destroy British armor at 800 meters, while British 2-pounders struggled to penetrate Panzer frontal plates even at 400, leaving British crews forced into desperate charges that cost over 500 tanks in a single campaign. And worse still, their lack of high explosive shells meant German 88mm crews could stand openly in the desert without fear, while British tankers closed suicidal distances just to be killed before they could even aim, turning the conflict into not just a tactical disaster, but a crisis of confidence as crews realized their tools were broken. And by early 1942, the British desperately needed a miracle, which arrived in January when the first M3 Grants rolled into Egypt. The British version modified with a lower-profile turret and internal radio, and named after General Ulysses S. Grant, while the taller American variant retained the lead designation. And when British tank crews gathered around these tower machines, their first reaction was disbelief at the absurd height that made them visible for miles across flat desert. But then they examined the gun, a 75mm. Weapon nearly twice the caliber of their 2-pounders, capable of firing both armor-piercing and high-explosive shells. And when they test-fired, the results were astonishing, as at 1,000 meters it punched clean through armor plate representing a Panzer III. At 1,500 meters it still achieved lethal hits, and its high-explosive rounds demolished gun positions, fortifications, and infantry concentrations from ranges where enemy weapons could not reply, transforming British morale overnight as crews who had spent 18 months dying with pop guns suddenly possessed a weapon that could kill anything on the battlefield. And though the Grant was ugly, tall, and tactically awkward, it could destroy German tanks from over a kilometer away, prompting British commanders to assign 167 of them to the 4th Armored Brigade and position them along Rommel's expected axis of advance, while German intelligence reported the arrival of strange, tall American vehicles with hull-mounted guns only for Rommel's staff to dismiss them as obvious targets based on outdated concepts, confident that experienced Panzer crews would easily deal with such awkward machines, leading Rommel to launch Operation Venezia on May 26, 1942, sweeping south around the Gazal line, exactly as planned with expectations of another British collapse. Until on the morning of May 27th, his advancing Panzer units collided with the 4th Armored Brigade, and as German commanders maneuvered to their standard engagement distance of 500 meters, they were shocked when British tanks opened fire from over 1,200 meters, shells slamming into Panzer formations from ranges previously considered safe, with the 1st Panzer erupting in flame followed by another and another as German crews struggled to understand what was happening. Their short-barrel 50mm guns unable to penetrate Grant armor at that distance, while British gunners calmly worked their targets, creating a deadly killing zone hundreds of meters deep, where Grants could destroy Panzers that could not shoot back, prompting German commanders to accelerate forward in desperate attempts to close the gap only to be cut down shot after shot before reaching effective range, breaking the discipline of the Afrika Korps as radio traffic dissolved into confusion, and veteran crews who had mocked the splendid targets now screamed about invisible batteries, destroying them from the horizon, flooding headquarters with reports that British tanks were engaging from beyond kilometer while German shells failed to penetrate at range, stalling the attack on the British center and forcing Rommel to recognize immediately what had changed, that the Americans had given the British a tank whose gun outranged everything in his army, erasing 18 months of equipment superiority in a single morning, a realization he later captured in his own words when he admitted that until May 1942 German tanks had generally been superior and that this was now no longer true, at least not to the same extent, a careful phrase that masked the shock of suddenly facing an enemy with equal firepower, forcing Rommel to adapt by pushing 88mm anti-aircraft guns forward to engage Grants from extreme range and urgently requesting Panzer IV Specials equipped with long-barreled 75mm cannons capable of matching Grant's reach, though these upgrades would not arrive in meaningful numbers for months, while the Grant's height remained a fatal flaw on open desert where German observers could spot them from miles away, ensuring every engagement began with the enemy knowing exactly where British armor was positioned, allowing Rommel to win the Battle of Gazal through maneuver and tactical brilliance rather than equipment superiority, capturing Tobruk in June and earning promotion to Field Marshal, yet suffering tank losses he could not replace because German factories produced only about 300 tanks per month, while American factories were already turning out over 2,000, meaning every destroyed Panzer was effectively irreplaceable, while every lost Grant could be replaced within weeks, turning Rommel's victories hollow as he slowly lost the Industrial War. And when the British finally halted his advance at El Alamein in July, the Grants proved sufficient to hold defensive lines where German armor was forced to attack head-on, bleeding. The Afrika Korps of crews and machines it could never recover, fulfilling the M3's original purpose as an emergency stopgap designed to hold the line until better tanks arrived, which they did in October 1942, when the first M4 Shermans reached Egypt with proper rotating turrets, lower profiles, and fully integrated 75mm guns, allowing Montgomery to assemble overwhelming force for the Second Battle of El Alamein with over 1,000 tanks and artillery pieces, launching his offensive on October 23 and driving Rommel into full retreat 12 days later in a defeat from which the Afrika Korps would never recover, marking the end of the Grant's brief 6-month frontline career, during which it held the line from Gazala to El Alamein and stripped German armored forces of irreplaceable strength. And today, surviving M3s sit quietly in museums as visitors walk past them towards Shermans and Tigers, glancing at the awkward 10-foot silhouette and wondering why anyone would build something so ungainly, unaware that American engineers knew every flaw before the first M3 left the factory: the height, the hull gun, the riveted armor, but built it anyway because the alternative was nothing, because the M3 was never meant to be the best tank in the world, only to exist when the best tank was not yet possible, a reality Rommel himself acknowledged when he observed that the Americans had designed, built, and deployed an effective medium tank in under a year, something Germany simply could not match. And in that single compromised vehicle lay the true power of American warfare, not elegance or perfection, but the brutal ability to turn industry into battlefield reality faster than any opponent on Earth.